Chapter 8. A sinking feeling. The man gunned his engine hard. When he took off, his rear wheels churned up a cloud of dust, and the car's back end slewed around sharply as he swung onto the paved highway. As a result, Frank was not able to spot the license number. Disgusted, the Hardy boy returned to his brother and their Mohawk friend, Hank. Eagle. What happened? Joe asked. That fellow was eavesdropping on us, Frank said angrily. Did you get a look at him? Yes, Joe replied. Enough to recognize him again. He had on dark glasses, sort of an oldish guy, with long gray hair curling down over his ears. Right. Frank had noticed a strange look pass over the Indian's face on hearing the man's description. Do you know him, Hank? The Mohawk shrugged. We get a lot of people stopping by to watch us. I may have seen him before. Hard to say. Later, after thanking their newfound friend for his interesting guided tour of the worksite, the Hardys drove back to Hawk River. Did you notice the way Hank reacted when you described that eavesdropper? Frank asked Joe. I sure did. As if he was covering up something. Joe added wryly, something tells me he was attempting to be a poker-faced Indian, only he didn't get his poker face on fast enough. You think he was lying? I think he was trying not to lie. Same here, Frank said thoughtfully. But I still like him. The Hardys arrived at the cottage around noon and found Chet working on his birchbark canoe. It lay overturned on the ground in front of the cabin. How are you coming along, Chet? Joe asked. Great. It's almost done. Just have to finish sewing these strips of bark together, which isn't easy on the fingers, I might add. Just then they heard the phone ringing. Frank dashed into the cabin to answer. The caller was Elena Tabor. How would you boys like to come on a picnic? She asked. Sounds great, Frank replied. When and where? Soon as you're ready. I took a chance and told Pokey to pack a lunch for us. Elena suggested a quiet curving branch of the Hawk River, not far from the cottage, as a place to hold the picnic, and described a particularly pleasant spot on the riverbank where she would meet the boys. I'd better confess right now that I have an ulterior motive for suggesting this picnic, she added, lowering her voice. Something has come up that you should know about. We can talk privately at this spot I've picked without running the risk of someone snooping on our conversation. Smart idea. We'll be there, Frank promised. Chet was in a dilemma when he heard about the invitation. Although eager for another chance to see his new dream girl, he was also desperately anxious to finish his canoe. The stout youth stood scratching his head for a moment, with a look of frustration on his freckled moon face and perspiration glistening on his tubby torso. Listen, he said finally. You go ahead and I'll join you as soon as I can. Okay, the Hardys agreed. Just one thing, Chet added as they turned away. What's that? Joe asked. Don't start lunch till I get there. The boys hiked to the picnic spot and found Elena waiting for them on the bank of the sparkling stream with her red miniwagon parked nearby. She wore jeans and a pretty embroidered cotton blouse, and was holding a copy of the local paper, the Hawk River Herald. Big news? Joe inquired. Bad news, I'm afraid. At least it's not very pleasant from my family's standpoint. She handed him the paper. Frank and Joe saw its banner headline. Another werewolf attack. But Elena pointed to a different story splashed all over the front page. It was a lengthy report of the Tabor family's werewolf tradition, and pointed out that young Tabor was a seventh-generation descendant of the last alleged werewolf, Jan Tabor. This, the story implied, automatically made him a prime suspect in the local outbreak of lycanthropy. That's a shame, Frank said with a sympathetic frown when he finished reading. But I'm not really surprised. Elena's eyebrows went up. What do you mean? That nasty little werewolf masquerade at your barbecue yesterday evening. Whoever was wearing that outfit was limping as if he'd been shot in the leg. Like your ancestor Jan Tabor. So you noticed too. Frank nodded. The author of a book on werewolves told us about those old-time cases. And if someone here at Hawk River has found out about your ancestor, and was malicious enough to play that prank last night, it seemed pretty likely the story would soon get around. Can you imagine how all the neighbors will be talking now? Elena said. Unhappily. If people start picking on John or he imagines they suspect him, I hate to think how he'll react. I'm afraid he'll end up in a worse state than ever. The Hardys tried to comfort the girl as best they could. Luckily there was soon a distraction to take her mind off the subject. Frank and Joe saw her eyes widen and she pointed toward the stream. "Look!" she exclaimed. A majestic figure clad in a buckskin hunting shirt was paddling toward them in a birch-bark canoe. "It's Chet!" Joe cried out. Their beefy chum made a striking sight in his wilderness costume as he swung his dripping paddle from one side of the canoe to the other. "He's even wearing an Indian headband," Frank muttered. Chet was sitting rigidly upright like a stalwart mountain man or impassive redskin brave. Presently he paused from paddling and struck a gazing pose as if scanning a distant shore for a sign of friend or foe. The Hardys stifled wild chuckles, realizing their pal was doing all this to impress Elena. Suddenly Frank frowned. "Am I seeing things, or is that canoe getting lower and lower in the water?" "You're not seeing things," Joe confirmed. "Chet's sinking." Both boys realized that their pal must be feeling very uncomfortable with the water rising higher and higher around his hips. Nevertheless, his chubby face retained its dignified expression with no sign of panic. The only hint of anxiety was that he began paddling faster and faster. Could he reach shore before his craft capsized? The Hardys wondered. The answer was soon apparent, however. In a few moments the canoe had sunk, practically out of sight. Chet cast his dignity to the wind and tried to leap overboard. Unfortunately his foot caught on the gunwale and he plopped headfirst into the river in a resounding belly flop that sent water splashing high in the air. The canoe corkscrewed over on one side, appending for a moment, then once again sinking from view. Chet, meanwhile, was flailing the water with his arms and legs, trying to get his bearings and strike out for shore. Elena had run to the river's edge with Frank and Joe. "Is he all right?" she asked anxiously. "Sure, no problem," Frank replied. "Chet's the best water polo player at Bayport High. But it looks as if he may lose that canoe he sweated so hard over," Joe added. Without another word, the plump, apple-cheeked girl kicked off her rope-soled espadrilles and dove gracefully into the water. "For crying out loud," Joe groaned. "She's making us look like backward chumps." Frank chuckled. "Never mind. They don't need our help." Apparently the river was about 5 or 6 feet deep at this point. Between them, Elena and Chet managed to retrieve the canoe and haul it ashore. The Hardys helped them drag it up on the bank. Chet was dewy-eyed with gratitude and astonishment that Elena had jumped in to help him. "That's the bravest thing I ever saw," he blurted. Elena smiled. "Well, I couldn't let you lose that beautiful canoe your friends say you worked so hard to make," she told him and gave him a consoling kiss on the cheek. To Chet, all the labor he had put into his canoe had paid off beyond his wildest dreams. He never stopped smiling while he and Frank examined the damage to the craft. Joe and Elena, meanwhile, went off to lay out the picnic lunch. "Here's your problem," Frank pointed out. "You sewed this row of stitches right in line with the way the bark splits. As a result, the bark is already starting to tear. Same down here. That's probably what caused the leaks. You should have staggered the stitch holes, or else run your stitches across the grain, so to speak." "Guess you're right," Chet said. "But who cares?" Lowering his voice and glancing over his shoulder, he added, "Boy, hasn't Elena got spunk, though. Think she likes me a little." "Could be," Frank said with a straight face. Pocahontas had packed chicken sandwiches and chocolate cake, and the picnic lunch proved to be a great success, despite the discomfort of Chet's and Elena's wet clothes. Afterwards, Frank steered the conversation back to the werewolf mystery and the feature in the Hawk River Herald. "Any idea how the editor might have gotten hold of all that information?" he inquired. Elena hesitated, her brow puckering. "As I told you, my father once mentioned it jokingly in a magazine interview." "What magazine?" "Worldaseek. I suppose the editor of the Herald ran across that story. I can't imagine where else he could have learned all those details," Elena said. "We'll find out," Joe promised. Frank nodded. "Another thing. Now that this old-time werewolf yarn has come out in the open, I think it's time Joe and I talk directly to your brother. He may know something important." A worried look flickered over Elena's face. "Is that really necessary?" "Both Dad and I are afraid it may only make John's delusions worse." "I don't see why. The very fact that Joe and I are trying to solve this mystery should prove to him that we don't take any stock in such superstitions, and we certainly don't believe he himself turns into a werewolf." When the moon is full. Elena smiled. Why, well then. How soon would you like to see John? This afternoon if possible. We can visit the Herald editor first and then go out to your place, that is, if your brother is in shape to talk to us. How did he act this morning, by the way? He slept like a log and didn't wake up till noon. He seemed fairly normal, but apparently doesn't remember a thing about what happened last night. Elena drove the boys back to the cabin with Chet's waterlogged canoe on top of her mini wagon. Then she went home. Meanwhile, the Hardys transferred to their own car and drove into Hawk River, leaving Chet to change into dry clothes. They found the Herald's office on the town's main street. The editor, a red-haired man named Lyle Dunn, recognized them immediately when they introduced themselves as the sons of Fenton Hardy. So you're up here to solve our great werewolf mystery. Let's say we'd like to do whatever we can, Frank said evenly. As you can. Imagine, that story you printed about the Tabor family is pretty embarrassing to them. The editor shrugged. We only print the news. What makes you so sure you got your facts right? Apparently you didn't even bother to check them out. Didn't need to, said Dunn. They came from an interview with Corel Tabor himself. Frank frowned. You mean the one that appeared in World to Seek magazine? Right, and confirmed by additional research data. Where'd you run across that? Joe asked. I didn't. It was mailed to me. The editor rose from his chair, pulled a manila envelope out of a file drawer, and showed its contents to the boys. One item was a photocopy of the magazine article, and there were several pages of typewritten notes stapled together. Each bore the printed initials DQ at the top. Joe whistled in surprise as he saw the latter. You said these came in the mail. Who was the sender? No idea. As you can see, there was no name on the envelope or inside it, either. Just an anonymous tip. Well, for your information, Frank said, that typewritten material was stolen from the author Desmond Quorn. A faint look of alarm passed over the editor's face. Furthermore, Frank went on, if readers get the impression from your story that John Tabor's responsible for these local werewolf attacks, you might be sued for libel. I didn't say Tabor was the werewolf. Dunn defended himself hastily, looking more alarmed than ever. Maybe not directly, but people would certainly get that idea. Why should they? This isn't the Middle Ages. There's no more reason why they should think John Tabor is some kind of wolfman than there is to blame the attacks on one of Alec Virgil's wolves. Who's Alec Virgil? Joe asked. A naturalist who runs what he calls a wolf farm near here. He breeds wolves, and some of them run pretty big too. The red-headed newsman got up from his desk again and fished some more material from another file drawer. There's a story I wrote about him a week or two ago. The Hardys read the clipping with keen interest. It reported how Alec Virgil carried on his project as a labor of love to help preserve the buffalo wolf species threatened with extinction. It also showed a photograph of Virgil standing beside the stuffed effigy of one of his earliest pet wolves. Frank rose from his chair. Okay, thanks for your time, Mr. Dunn. We appreciate your help. My pleasure, boys. Stop in any time. After leaving the Herald's office, the Hardys drove back to the cabin, picked up Chet, and went on to the Tabor home. Parking their car in the drive, Frank and Joe started up to the front door, with Chet tagging at their heels. Directly above, they could see the burly figure of Pocahontas, the half-breed housekeeper. She was perched on a second-floor sill washing windows. Frank hesitated a moment, not sure whether he ought to call up to her or draw her attention with a gentle knock. On the other hand, he reflected, Elena was expecting them and was probably downstairs ready to answer the door. He reached out to ring the bell. His finger had just pressed the button when both he and Joe heard a splashing sound and a muffled gasp and felt something wet splatter them from behind. Turning around, the Hardys gaped in astonishment. The housekeeper had just dumped her pail of water on Chet. Chapter 9. Ghostly Voices. Chet spluttered and gasped, drenched to the skin. Frank glanced up at Pocahontas, who was leaning outward from the windowsill. From the scowl on her coppery-skinned face, Frank was glad she did not have another pail of water handy. He had a hunch that otherwise he and his brother might have gotten the same treatment as Chet. Good grief, muttered Joe, appalled at their stout chum's face. The poor guy practically drowns before lunch and now gets doused all over again. Serves him right, growled Pocahontas just as the front door opened. That'll Teach him not to dump my little girl in the river. Pokey! Exclaimed Elena, taking in the scene at one horror-stricken glance. Chet didn't dump me in the river. His canoe sank and I dived in to help save it. Huh. The housekeeper tossed her braids defiantly. Amounts to the same thing. It was on account of him that pretty embroidered blouse of yours got ruined, after all the time I spent this morning ironing it just so. My blouse isn't ruined, Elena scolded. It just got soaked. And another thing, Polka. Before she could finish speaking, the housekeeper withdrew from her perch, and the Hardys heard the upstairs window being slammed. Oh, brother. Elena shook her head in vexation and embarrassment. That bossy old Mohawk. She'll drive me up the wall one of these days, the girl added. I'm so sorry about this. Come on in, boys, and I'll find some dry clothes for Chet. The stout youth blushed and mumbled awkwardly. You don't have to go to any trouble, Elena. He was shivering due to his wetness, but obviously pleased at her concern. Unfortunately, John Tabor's clothes were too small for Chet's barrel-shaped figure, so Elena dug up an old shirt and a pair of slacks which belonged to her father. After Chet retired to a bathroom to change, it became apparent that they were not a perfect fit either, but they would have to do until he could get dry clothes of his own back at the cottage. Never mind, Chet, said Joe with a sympathetic chuckle. At least you won't get busted for sneaking around in your underwear. The Hardys turned as they heard footsteps on the stairs. John was coming down to join them. The young architect looked more alert than he had when he had returned home in the wee hours of the morning, but he was obviously in poor spirits. He shook hands with the visitors, smiled wanly on hearing about Chet's comical mistreatment at the hands of Pocahontas, then settled himself in a chair. Frank hesitated, not sure how to begin. Finally he said, Perhaps you've heard of my father. His name is Fenton Hardy. John nodded. The famous detective. Yes, I rather thought you two might be the Hardy boys I've read so much about. I suppose Elena got you up here to get to the bottom of this werewolf mystery. I'm glad you call it a mystery, Frank said. That means you don't believe in those old superstitions about werewolves any more than we do. John Tabor shrugged unhappily and ran his fingers through his curly brown hair. Right now I don't know what to believe. I can't remember a thing about last night, either where I went or what happened while I was gone. But at least you don't think you turned into a wolf and attacked people or animals, put in Joe. Your common sense tells you that's impossible? Maybe so, John conceded. But that doesn't explain what I did do. You see, I'm not afraid of turning into a wolf. What worries me is that I may become insane, and if that happens I might wind up acting like a werewolf. Where did you first get the notion that you might be going out of your mind? Frank inquired. While I was studying for my architect's license. I'd be deep in my books or bent over the drawing board, and then I'd get these calls. What sort of calls, and from whom? Don't ask me. From people I never heard of before. Maybe people I just made up in some sick part of my mind. I used to imagine they were accusing me of being a werewolf. Joe frowned. How do you know you just imagined it? Maybe you really did get such calls. Sure, said Chet, trying to be helpful. It could have been someone playing a dirty trick on you. Tabor gave another helpless shrug. Maybe, but I find that pretty hard to accept. Why would anyone want to play such a trick on me? You can't think of anyone? Frank prodded. Nobody at all. I don't have any real enemies. I'm just not that important. Besides, the delusions got even worse after I checked into the sanatorium. Suppose Elena or my father told you about that. The sanatorium? Yes, your dad did mention that you'd gone for treatment too. The Pine Manor rest home, I believe. What happened? More calls? No. Just voices. From where? Joe asked. John Tabor rubbed his head in bewilderment at the disturbing recollection. I don't know. From the walls, I guess, or just out of thin air. I'd hear them in my room first at night when I was just drifting off to sleep. Later on, when it got worse, I'd even hear them during the day when I was wide awake. What did the voices say? Terrible things about rending fangs and bloodlust and so on. They said they were the voices of my old werewolf ancestors, like the Jan Tabor who was convicted in Bohemia in 1759. Seeing that both John and Elena were becoming upset, Frank decided to end the questioning for the time being. Look, he said, Would you mind if Joe and I went to that sanatorium and interviewed the doctor who treated you? Of course not, the young architect replied. If you think it'll help in any way. It can't do any harm, but we'll need a letter from you giving permission to ask questions about your case. And would you write down the name and address of the sanatorium too, please? John nodded and Frank asked for directions to Alec Virgil's wolf farm. After saying goodbye to Elena and her brother, the Hardys drove back to the cabin, so Chet could change into dry clothes of his own. Then they took the river road eastward out of town. The preserve lay spread out on a slope forested with cedar and hemlock, and was enclosed by a high wire fence. A sign over the gate said, Wolfvilla Alec Virgil, Prop. Guided tours $1 please ring bell. Joe did, and after a short wait a man drove up in a battered-looking jeep to greet them. He was tall and deeply tanned with a mane of sandy hair. Howdy boys, he said, unlocking and opening the gate. Come to see my Lobos. That's right, Mr. Virgil, Frank grinned. We heard about your place this afternoon. I never knew anyone who actually raised wolves. Someone's got to protect the species. In most places everyone's against them. There's a wonderful preserve on the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State, where they breed 5 times as many wolves as I've got here. Still I'm doing my bit. Because of the rough terrain, Virgil suggested the boys ride with him in his jeep. They paid their admission and climbed in. Where'd you get your wolves? Joe asked. The original stock came from the Great Plains. They used to run in packs when huge herds of buffalo dotted the plains, but they're all gone now. I bought half a dozen from the descendants of the last few caught by the government trappers in the late 1920s. Now I have 37. Good for you. Must take a lot of work, though. Virgil laughed. True. I have to be the general handyman, the vet, the animal feeder, the yard cleaner-upper, the purchasing agent, and a few other things. But my wife helps me, and we find it a lot more satisfying than the kind of life we used to lead back in the city. As they drove along, more and more wolves came bounding out from among the trees. Virgil slowed the jeep, and several Lobos jogged alongside, their tongues lolling. They were magnificent beasts, ranging in color from silver gray and blonde to cinnamon brown. Some were 7 feet long from nose to hind legs. At one point Alec Virgil stopped the jeep and got out to play with his charges. They surged around him, wild with delight at the chance for a romp. He wrestled with them and even rolled on the ground while they nipped playfully at his arms or legs, yet never doing him any harm with their huge jaws and fearsome-looking teeth. Are they dangerous? Chet asked. Yes and no, Mr. Virgil replied. Most of the stories about wolves attacking men are nonsense. They're actually shy creatures. But they're not lapdogs either. They should be respected. The boys decided to stay in the jeep. They found the wolves' yellow-eyed stares a bit disconcerting. Finally Virgil drove to his house and invited the guests in for coffee. When he found out that Frank and Joe were the sons of the famous Fenton Hardy, he wanted to refund their admission. But the boys refused, knowing from Elena that the naturalist was often hard-pressed to keep his farm going. Mrs. Virgil, a smiling motherly woman, served coffee and donuts, then went outside. While the boys sat around the fireplace, her husband told them more about the sad story of the plains wolves. When hunters killed off the buffalo herds and thinned out the elk and antelope and deer populations, he related, many wolves starved. Others took to preying on livestock. So the ranchers and settlers went after them with poison and traps. It was a long, desperate duel. The wolves learned to refuse the poisoned bait and became incredibly cunning at avoiding traps. But finally, the humans won, and the Lobos disappeared from the plains. As he finished speaking, the distant howl of a wolf was heard from outside. Then others joined in. The boys were thrilled by the eerie chorus, but gradually it changed to wilder yelping and barking. Alec Virgil rose from his chair in alarm. Just then his wife hurried in, her face pale with excitement. Someone's cut the fence wire, she cried. Our wolves are getting out. Chapter 10. Skyscraper Caper. What part of the fence? Virgil asked his wife. When she told him, he moved into action swiftly like a man used to handling such crises. He slipped a small whistle into his pocket, got some meat from a freezer in the shed, then climbed behind the wheel of his jeep. With the boys accompanying him, he careened off through the trees toward the section of cut fence. Some of the wolves, more cautious than dogs might have been, were merely nosing around and sniffing at the freedom that lay beyond the opening. Others had already plunged through and were exploring the brush along the road. Virgil leaped out of the jeep and blew his whistle. Even though it did not make a sound audible to the human ear, the escaped wolves instantly turned and loped toward the enclosure, slowly at first, then faster and faster as he waved handfuls of meat in the air. Soon he was the center of a frenzied mass of leaping, snapping lobos. Virgil flung the meat in several directions, but all of it away from the fence. The pack raced off, each animal eager to fight for his share. Satisfied that all his wolves were accounted for, Virgil hastily moved the jeep so as to block any further escape through the hole in the fence. Then, using tools and wire from a repair kit mounted on the back of the vehicle, he and the boys wired the ripped fencing back in place. There was no doubt that it had been cut deliberately. Who'd do such a thing? Frank asked. You'd be surprised, Virgil said wryly. I've had all sorts of trouble ever since I started my wolf farm. Most people hate wolves and think they should all be wiped out. Maybe they would be if it weren't for people like you and your wife, said Joe. Alec. Virgil smiled and nodded. Yep, Mary and I love the critters. When the mother wolves bring out their pups to show us every spring, the little ones are rather like our own grandchildren. He explained that the she-wolves burrowed underground dens in which to raise their litters. At night, the wolf families were kept in separate pens or runs instead of ranging freely over the whole preserve. Which gives you double protection against a breakout? Joe remarked. That's right. Good thing, too, with this werewolf foolishness going on. Don't intend to give people around here any excuse to blame those so-called werewolf attacks on my critters. How come we didn't hear that whistle you blew? Chet asked as they drove back to the house. Was it ultrasonic? Yep, it's inaudible to human ears, but my lobos hear it. Usually it's the signal for feeding time, but they're trained to respond any time I whistle. Hey! Frank suddenly snapped his fingers. That may explain it. Explain what? Joe inquired. What happened Saturday night at the Bayport Diner? Look, Mr. Virgil blew that ultrasonic whistle for his wolves to come, and he used the meat as an extra scent lure. So, Joe looked puzzled. Maybe that phony werewolf we saw was trained like an attack dog and its owner swiped my jacket as a scent guide to clue it into our group. I'll bet you're right, said Joe, catching on. He let the animal sniff your jacket so it would know to attack you when we came out of the diner. Then Chet and the others rushed to help us, and he blew an ultrasonic whistle to call his critter back. What are you talking about? Alec. Virgil asked. After they went into the house again to finish their donuts and coffee, they explained what had happened, and Virgil agreed that Frank's theory was a very likely one. Joe inquired about the stuffed wolf that had been shown in the newspaper photo. I don't see it anywhere, the boy remarked. I sold it, or thought I did, Alec. Virgil replied. Turned out to be just another dirty trick. He explained that he had received a phone call after the picture appeared in the Hawk River Herald. The caller, pretending to be a wealthy donor, said he wanted to buy the wolf and present it as a gift to the Mountain View Natural History Museum. That lobo had been a special pet of man's and mine, Virgil went on, and we hated to part with it. But the caller offered us $1,000. Since the wolf farm existed on occasional grants and donations from animal lovers and the admission fees paid by sightseers, meeting the monthly bills was often a struggle. So the couple finally agreed to sell their beloved specimen. A truck came and picked it up, Virgil told the boys, and the driver left a check which turned out to be worthless. When I called the museum, the curator knew nothing about it and said he had never received the wolf. Later, back at the cabin, the boys were about to sit down to an early supper when the telephone rang. Joe answered and recognized Hank Eagle's voice. Hi, Hank, he said cordially. Where are you calling from? New York City. I flew back at lunchtime in Mr. Tabor's helicopter. He told me where you're staying. The Mohawk explained that, during the afternoon, he had rejoined his regular high-steel construction crew working on the Manhattan skyscraper which Chelsea builders were erecting. And I spotted something I think you ought to see, Hank went on. It may be important to that case your father's investigating. Could you come to New York right away? You mean tonight? Yes. Something may happen here that you'll want to keep an eye on. Joe checked with Frank, and they decided to follow Hank's suggestion. He gave them precise instructions on where to meet him. Then the boys called Bayport to inform their father, only to learn that he was gone for the evening. However, their mother told them that they had received an anonymous phone message about 3 o'clock. It was a man, she reported. He said he was the person with dark glasses, whom you saw at Eagle's Nest this morning. What did he want? Frank asked excitedly. He wants to meet you. Call 555-3621 and ask for Mr. Nest. The area code is 212. Thanks for the info, Mom, Frank said and hung up. It's a New York number, Joe pointed out. That fits in nicely with our trip. Tonight. Right, Frank agreed and dialed the number. An answering service responded, but the operator was unable to arrange a meeting. Mr. Nest, she said, calls in every so often to see if there's any word from the Hardy boys. In fact, I heard from him just about 20 minutes ago, so I don't know how soon he'll call again. Okay, Frank said. If he checks in, tell him we'll be in New York tonight. I'll contact you again around 10 o'clock. After a hasty meal, the Hardys started the long drive to New York, leaving a somewhat nervous Chet to keep watch on the Tabor's house after dark. Dusk had fallen as they sped southward on the New York State Thruway, and it was well past 9 when they arrived in Manhattan. They parked in a midtown lot as Hank Eagle had suggested, and walked a block or so to the meeting place. The Mohawk was waiting for them in a doorway across the street from the skyscraper which was under construction by Chelsea builders. He quickly told the boys the reason for his call. Just before I quit working, Hank said, I noticed a lunchbox stashed against a girder. You mean somewhere high up on the building skeleton? Joe asked. Right. The 21st floor to be exact. Often when the men are working, they don't bother coming down to the street for lunch. Anyhow, I figured one of the construction crew must have forgotten it when he left. So I opened it thinking there might be something in it to clue me into whom it belonged. Hank shook his head as if still slightly incredulous. Boy, you'll never guess what I found inside. Something suspicious? Frank suggested. You better believe it. There was a drawing like a building floor plan with an X mark and some numbers. At first I thought it might have something to do with the skyscraper we're working on, but then as I looked at it closely I realized that it was a layout of our company offices on 7th Avenue. What about the X mark? Joe questioned. That's what made me call you. It indicated the location of the company safe. Those numbers were probably the combination. What's more, there was also a key in the lunchbox, perhaps to the outside door of the office suite. Joe whistled. Wow, that sounds like a preparation for a robbery, an inside job. But who could have left the lunchbox? Any idea? Hank related that a group of company officials had visited the structure that very afternoon. Some had on loose cotton dust coats, so one of them might have smuggled up the lunchbox and left it, or at least stashed the paper and key if the box was already planted there. Then tonight when it's dark, maybe the crook who'll pull the robbery is supposed to pick it up. Smart thinking, Hank, Frank agreed. That could be their plan, all right. And the guys who set it up, Joe added, may also be involved in those 3 Chelsea building cases Dad's investigating. Right, which is why I tipped you 2 off, said the Indian high steel worker. But what do we do about it? The Hardys exchanged thoughtful glances. Think we should warn Mr. Tabor? Joe asked his brother. After all, he's the head of the company. I know, Frank said, deciding to trust the Mohawk and speak openly in front of him. But we still can't be sure he himself isn't mixed up in all this. Was he one of the company officials who came here today to inspect the structure? Hank nodded ruefully. I'm afraid he was. Looks as if we'll have to play it by ear then, and use our own judgment. Frank decided. How do we know the lunchbox is still there? Joe asked. The Mohawk shrugged. We don't. I've been hanging around here ever since it got dark, trying to keep my eyes peeled for anything suspicious, but that doesn't prove much. Maybe we'd better check. Isn't there a watchman on duty? Frank inquired. Sure, but he's a lazy bum. Spends most of the time with his feet up reading the paper. Anyone could sneak by him. Okay then, if it won't stir up any trouble, let's have a look. The skyscraper was going up between 2 other buildings. The base of its structural skeleton was enclosed by a high board fence. After cautious glances to see whether the coast was clear, the 3 darted across the street. Hank Eagle gave each of the Hardys a boost up the fence, then leaped for a handhold, and swung over easily by himself. In a lighted booth just inside the access doorway through the fence, they could see the watchman snoring with a newspaper on his lap and a thermos of coffee on the table next to him. See what I mean? Hank grinned. How do we get to the 21st floor? Joe inquired. There's a freight hoist, but it makes a lot of noise when you switch on the motor. It'd probably wake even him up. Better walk. Temporary wooden stairways had been erected for the workmen, leading up through the building skeleton. The Hardys and their Mohawk friend felt legged as they neared their destination in spite of their trim physical condition. Suddenly they heard a metallic clink in the darkness. Hold it! Hank Eagle hissed, putting a hand on each boy's arm. They were ascending a connecting stairway on the right side of the structure. Peering outward and upward, they discovered that someone had heaved a line from a window of the adjoining building to hook onto the floor of the skyscraper skeleton somewhere above them. As they watched, they could see the dark figure of a man silhouetted in the moonlight, shinnying his way up from the window along the rope. I'll bet he's going after the lunchbox, Joe whispered. Right. Let's get him, Frank urged. All three dashed up the stairs on tiptoe. As they reached the 21st floor, they saw the intruder scramble over the edge and onto the temporary flooring of the skyscraper. Then he darted silently across the wooden planks. That's what he's after, all right, Hank muttered to the boys. The lunchbox is over that way. They moved to cut off the stranger's retreat to the hook and line, but evidently he heard them. With a fleeting glance over his shoulder, he ran nimbly over an open girder toward another part of the structure. The very thought of his reckless flight hundreds of feet above the ground made the Hardys dizzy. Hank Eagle set off after him without hesitation. Wait, don't try it, you too, he told the Hardys as he dashed over the girder in pursuit. Leave this to me. Watching the two figures intently in the moonlit gloom, the brothers saw the fugitive reach another stairway. Instead of heading downward to street level, he started up, bounding 2 or 3 steps at a stride. Keep an eye on him while I try to cut him off, Joe blurted and darted back to the stairway they themselves had used. Construction on the skyscraper had progressed only 3 stories higher, with the unfinished skeleton ending on the 24th floor. As he reached it, Joe caught sight of the intruder, who was running across the wooden planking toward the edge of the structure. Joe sensed his intention at a glance. He was going to leap down onto the roof of the adjoining building, from which he had emerged only a few minutes before. The Hardy boy rushed to stop him. He grabbed the fugitive by the arm, but the man broke loose with a muttered oath. They grappled wildly at the brink of the planking. Too late, Joe saw the man's fist swinging at him in the moonlight. The blow caught him on the side of the head and he lost his balance. With a startled cry, Joe toppled into the yawning darkness below. Chapter 11. Xavier's story. Plummeting downward, Joe saw a rope flash past his eyes. He grabbed it desperately, and the jerk on his arm confirmed that his fall had been broken. As he collected his wits, Joe realized he had managed to grab hold of the line, which the intruder had hooked onto the skyscraper. What a lucky break, Joe thought. With a prayer of thanks on his lips, he got a two-handed grip on the line. Then he swung his legs around the rope as a further safety measure and made his way downward cautiously, hand over hand. The line slanted outward, away from the skyscraper skeleton into the adjoining building. As Joe shinnied down the rope and wriggled through the window, a new thought occurred to him. Perhaps the contents of the room he was now in would enable him to identify the unknown intruder, or maybe indicate whom he worked for if others were involved. But when Joe groped along the wall and found a light switch, he was disappointed. The room was empty, evidently an unrented office. The line had been tied to a radiator underneath the window. Hastily he switched off the light again so as not to make a target of himself. Better not stick my head out the window either, Joe reflected. The safest way would be to go down to the street and wait for Frank and Hank Eagle. Luckily the building corridors were still lighted and the elevators were working. A night attendant glanced at Joe curiously as he stepped into the lobby but said nothing. Joe went out into the street and was greeted with excited relief by his brother and their Mohawk friend a moment or two later. Thank goodness you're okay, Frank exclaimed, putting an arm around his brother's shoulder. Boy, I thought you were a goner when I saw you go over the side. I never even got a good look at the guy before he punched me, Joe grumbled. What happened to him? He jumped on the roof of the building you went into, Frank reported, and then took off via the fire escape. Well, at least he didn't get what he came for, Hank Eagle added, displaying the lunchbox. The paper and key were still inside it. That's a break, Joe said with satisfaction. Whatever he and his pals were up to, we seem to have spoiled their plans. Right, Frank agreed. So I guess we don't have to worry about warning anyone till we get a chance to talk to Dad. He looked at his watch. But maybe we should give Mr. Nest another ring. When he dialed the number from a nearby phone booth, the answering service operator said there had been no further word from their mysterious caller. Frank promised to check again the following day and hung up. Hank Eagle invited the boys to stay overnight at his apartment in the Manhattan neighborhood known as the East Village, and they gladly accepted. Next morning Frank phoned Bayport. Fenton Hardy answered. When he learned his son was calling from New York City, the detective exclaimed, "Great! You couldn't have timed it better." "How come, Dad?" "I've just had word from the insurance underwriters that the offices of Chelsea Builders were broken into last night. The safe was cracked and looted. I'd like you and Joe to go there and get a full report." Frank was startled by the news. When he related their adventure on the skyscraper skeleton, Mr. Hardy agreed with Hank Eagle's suspicions. "I'd say last night's burglary proves your Mohawk friend was right. The crooks probably had to break in and crack the safe because you fellows stopped them from getting the key and combination." The detective said he expected to leave the house shortly to pursue his investigation. So rather than phone back, Frank promised that he and Joe would stop off in Bayport before returning to the Adirondacks and report what they had learned about the burglary. Chelsea Builders were located in an office building on 7th Avenue near 38th Street. The Hardys found the premises swarming with police and newsmen. After identifying themselves as the sons of the famed private detective who had been retained by the firm's insurance underwriters, they were admitted at once to the office of the president, Correll Tabor. With him was a younger man, whom Mr. Tabor introduced as his executive assistant, Neil Xavier. Tabor's manner seemed rather curt and worried. "Can you tell us what was taken from the safe, sir?" Frank asked. "Luckily less than $1,000. Just the usual petty cash that we keep on hand." "Anything else of special value?" Joe inquired. Mr. Tabor looked slightly uncomfortable. "We don't have an exact list of the safe's contents just yet. The treasurer's secretary is compiling one," he replied, then stole a hasty glance at his wristwatch. "Look, if you'll excuse me, I have a rather urgent appointment to attend to. Perhaps Mr. Xavier here can answer any other questions you may have." The Hardys refrained from showing their surprise. "Whatever you say, sir," Frank said politely. Neil Xavier, a sharp-eyed, hawk-nosed man with dark hair, conducted the boys into his own office next door and invited them to be seated. "You're probably wondering why Mr. Tabor had so little to say," he began, sitting down behind his desk. "Well, he had his reasons." The Hardys waited for Xavier to explain. "The fact is, he suspects another firm of architects may have had a hand in the robbery," the executive aide went on, "namely Upton Associates. But Mr. Tabor feels it's unethical to make any accusations without proof." Xavier thumped his fist angrily on the desk and added, "Well, I can tell you right now that won't stop me from speaking out. I think a crook is a crook and deserves whatever happens to him." "Assuming you're both right," said Joe, "that Upton Associates are crooks, why would they want to rob your safe?" "Very simple," Xavier replied. "For some time now my boss has suspected Upton of taking illegal kickbacks and bribes." "From whom?" said Frank with a frown. "From a crooked contractor with mob connections. Whenever Upton Associates designs buildings, they use their influence to see that that particular contractor gets hired to do the work, even though they know his firm is partly run by gangsters." "And in return," Joe said, "you mean the crooked contractor hands some of the money he has paid for the job back to Upton Associates?" "Right. Under the table, as they say. Since the contractor overcharges the customer, he can afford to return a share of the take to Upton. So happens Mr. Tabor's been collecting secret testimony about such payoffs on tape. But now those tapes are missing from the safe." Before leaving, the Hardys asked if they could look at the company safe. The door was hanging loosely by the hinges. Expert job, Joe remarked to his brother. Evidently the safecracker used just enough nitro to blow it open without damaging anything else. Frank nodded and knelt down to scrape some shreds of pinkish substance off the metal with his fingernail. He sniffed it and pulled it apart. Joe puckered his forehead. What is it? Believe it or not, it's chewing gum. As the Hardy boys left the Chelsea Builders suite of offices and started down the corridor toward the elevators, they suddenly heard footsteps starting up behind them. The next moment, each felt something jabbed in his back and a voice snarled, "Hold it, you Chapter 12. Restaurant meeting. Frank and Joe whirled around. From the speaker's snarling tone they expected to find a hard-eyed gunman behind them. Instead, they saw a smiling, freckle-faced young man in his early 20s. He held up a pen in one hand and a keychain flashlight in the other. "Excuse the funny stuff, fellows," he apologized. "Just wanted to make sure you didn't get away. You two are the famous Hardy boys, aren't you?" "That's right," Frank said. "I'm Matt Dawson of the Daily Star. Just new on the job, to tell you the truth. But I'd sure like to impress the city editor, and getting an interview with you guys would be a step in the right direction. How about it?" The Hardys exchanged dubious glances. Then Frank shook his head. "Thanks, but we'd rather not." "Are you or your father working on this case?" "If we were, we couldn't talk about it." "Look, that doesn't matter. You wouldn't have to discuss the Chelsea Builders burglary," the young reporter assured them. "Just an interview for a general feature story will do. Things like how you first got interested in solving mysteries, whether or not you expect to become professional detectives like your father, how your sleuthing fits in with your schoolwork, and so on." Frank hesitated. After consulting briefly with his brother, he said, "Okay. It's a deal, if you'll do us a favor in return." "Sure thing if I can. What do you have in mind?" "The Star is one of the city's biggest newspapers, I believe," Frank said. "You cover all the arts, don't you, including architecture?" "You bet. We've got as big an editorial staff as any paper in town, and one of the best in the country. A man named Earl Bruce writes a regular column on architecture in the Sunday Star. Fine. We'll give you an interview if you can persuade him to give us some information in exchange." Dawson grinned. "You've got it, fellows." The Hardys accompanied the reporter several blocks through Midtown Manhattan to the Star building. Once there, Matt Dawson called the paper's architectural critic on an office phone to confirm the bargain. Frank and Joe were then interviewed and photographed for half an hour. Afterward, Dawson took them to Earl Bruce's office on another floor of the building and left the two to talk to the editor in private. "Well, boys, what is it you want to know?" the genial white-haired newsman inquired. "First of all, sir," Frank requested, "we'd like you to keep this conversation in strict confidence if you don't mind." "Agreed. Thanks. To get right to the point, then, what can you tell us about an architectural firm called Upton Associates?" Bruce leaned back in his chair and began filling his pipe thoughtfully. "Well, they've been in practice for about 15 years, as I recall. Do quite a sizable volume of business. Commercial stuff, mostly. Office buildings, factories, that sort of thing. Plus several bridges and occasional government projects." "Who runs the firm?" Joe put in. "A man named Zachary Upton." "What's he like?" A quirky grin shaped itself on Bruce's lips. "Let's say he's a man of strong individuality." "Has there ever been any trouble between Upton and Chelsea Builders?" Frank asked. "Not trouble exactly, but I believe there has been considerable rivalry between them. I know they've often put in competing bids on the same job. No doubt that may have led to a certain amount of hard feelings. After all, they can't both win out on the same project." "Have Upton Associates ever been accused of anything crooked or illegal?" Bruce, who was just lighting his pipe, looked up sharply at Frank's question. "Not that I know of, although I believe Upton has a son who was convicted of some crime and sent to prison." "On what charge?" The white-haired newsman thought hard for a few moments, then shook his head. "I'm afraid I don't recall. It didn't happen here in New York City. I just heard it mentioned in a conversation." After a few more questions, the Hardys thanked Earl Bruce for his help and left the office. In the lobby, Frank paused near a pay telephone. "Maybe we should try to get in touch with Mr. Nest again," he suggested. "Good idea," Joe agreed. Frank slipped a coin into the instrument and dialed the number. When the answering service replied, He asked if Mr. Nest had checked in yet. Let me see, the operator replied and consulted her notes. Yes, he called this morning and suggested meeting you at the Soup Bowl restaurant on East 49th Street. He said he'd contact me again at 11:30 to see if you'd gotten the message. Good enough, said Frank. Tell him we'll be there. Hanging up, the boy glanced at his watch. It was now 10 minutes after 11. So the Hardys decided to go directly to the restaurant and have an early lunch. After looking up the address in the phone book, they hailed a taxi, which deposited them in front of the Soup Bowl a few minutes later. The restaurant was already quite busy, but the brothers found a vacant booth and ordered hamburgers and French fries. While they were waiting to be served, Frank mused, I wonder if that gum on the safe got there strictly by accident, or if it may not tell us something more. Good question, said Joe. You think it might have turned up on other jobs the guys pulled? Frank nodded thoughtfully. One of the first principles of detection that the Hardys had learned from their father was that a crook's modus operandi, or operating procedure, was often the best way to identify the person responsible for a given crime. You may have something there, Joe said. Why don't you call Sam Radley? There's a phone booth over by the counter. You might catch him in if he's not working with Dad today. Good idea. Frank got up and placed a long-distance call to Bayport. Sam Radley was one of Fenton Hardy's top operatives. As it turned out, he was writing a report at his desk and answered immediately. What can I do for you? Frank. I'm calling from New York, Sam. I wonder if you could check the files and see if you have anything on a safecracker whose known habits include leaving traces of chewing gum on the safe. Sam chuckled. I don't have to look. It so happens your dad wanted a rundown on the same crook recently in connection with his investigation of those 3 building disasters. No kidding. Frank felt a surge of excitement. The guy in question is a young fellow, a regular technical and electronic whiz, Radley went on. Caught out of prison not long ago. He has a habit of chewing bubble gum while he's working on a job. And sometimes the bubbles burst and gum splatters the safe? Right. That's how he got his nickname Bubbles. His real name is Lou Upton. Thanks a lot, Sam. Frank hung up and hurried back to pass on the information to his brother. The waitress had brought their orders, and Joe was already munching a hamburger. Upton? He echoed with his mouth still half full. He could be Zachary Upton-Esson. Check. The one who was convicted and sent to prison, Frank said. The two discussed the latest development eagerly as they ate lunch. Then Frank happened to glance toward the door. He signaled to Joe and said in a low tone, Here comes our man. The mysterious eavesdropper who called himself Mr. Nest had just entered the restaurant and was approaching their table. Gray-haired with a rather shrunken, wrinkled face, he was wearing sunglasses as before and an expensive-looking bronze silk suit. So you kept our appointment. That's good, he remarked hoarsely, sliding into the booth beside Joe. Maybe we can do business. What kind of business? Frank asked coolly. Don't stall around, Sonny, the elderly man rasped. I've got just one thing to discuss with you, and that's the tomahawk. Can we work out a deal or can't we? The Hardys stared at him, puzzled. They had no idea what Mr. Ness was talking about. First you'd better tell us what tomahawk, Joe demanded, fishing for information. Instead of answering, however, Mr. Nest leaped up from the booth and hurried out of the rest. Chapter 13. Toy boat trick. Hey, wait, Joe called, but the gray-haired mystery man had disappeared before the boys recovered from their surprise. Come on, let's go after him, Frank exclaimed, springing to his feet. He dashed toward the door, but as he passed the counter, the cashier reached out and grabbed his arm. Just a minute, she protested indignantly. You can't sneak out of here without paying. Frank started to explain but saw that it would be useless, so he fished money out of his pocket and hastily settled their bill. Meanwhile, Joe brushed past him to pursue Mr. Nest. As he ran out the door, Kane was suddenly thrust in front of him. Joe tripped and sprawled full length on the pavement. Angrily, he got up and turned to let off steam at the person responsible for the mishap. Then he saw that the cane was held by a poorly dressed man, clutching a tin cup with pencils, evidently a blind beggar. Sorry if I got in your way, the man mumbled. Joe stifled the angry remark that had risen to his lips. Never mind, he said, and hastily collected himself to renew the pursuit. His eyes swept the throng of passing pedestrians and picked out a gray-haired man in a bronze-colored suit near the next corner, about to cross the street. Joe dashed after him, shouldering his way deftly through the crowd, muttering apologies whenever he bumped into someone. He reached the curb and started across just as the light was changing. With a blare of horns, a pack of cars surged into motion and roared straight at him in the typical impatient fashion of New York traffic. Joe leaped and hopped across the street, dodging a taxi, a station wagon, and a delivery van. His pulse was racing as he reached the opposite corner, but there was no time to stop and cool his jangled nerves. He could see the man in the brownish suit not far ahead. Joe darted and swivel-hipped his way through the stream of pedestrians. He reached his quarry and grabbed him by the arm. Okay, Mr. Nest, if that's your real name. Hold it. The man turned. He had a large red nose, veiny jowls, and bushy-browed blue eyes which at the moment were sparking dangerously. Let go of my arm, young fellow, he growled. Just who do you think you are? Joe's eyes widened in chagrin as he saw his mistake.
I'm terribly sorry.
He stuttered. I thought you were someone else. Oomph. The man grunted. Next time don't grab people before you see who they are. Apparently mollified by Joe's apology, he strode off. The younger Hardy plodded back dejectedly toward the restaurant. Crossing the street, he encountered his brother. Any luck? Frank inquired. Yes, all of it bad, Joe said wryly and related his two brief adventures. If to rub in his humiliation, he saw that the man with the cane had disappeared. I'll bet that blind beggar was just a phony, Joe blurted. Nest probably planted him there to slow us down, in case we came after him. Very likely, Frank agreed. Nest's name is phony too, for that matter. Sure, from the name of that old wooden mansion where you spotted him, Eagles Nest. Well, never mind, Joe. We can't win 'em all. Let's go back and finish our hamburgers. But another letdown was in store. When they returned to the restaurant, they saw that their table had already been cleared. The rest of their meal was probably in the garbage by now. Even Frank was disgusted. Want to order something else? He asked his brother. Forget it. I just lost my appetite. Frank decided to use the phone booth again. He called Chelsea Builders and asked Carell Tabor's secretary for the name and address of the client for whom the firm was restoring Eagle's Nest. Frank jotted down the information she gave him, then hung up and turned to Joe. Let's look him up when we get a chance. He might be able to give us a lead on Mr. Nest. Good hunch. But what'll we do right now? Call Zachary Upton and ask for an interview. Not here though. Let's go to a place where I can carry on a phone conversation without all this babble and clatter of dishes. In the lobby of an office building down the street, they found a pay telephone. In a quiet, secluded corner, Joe leafed through the Manhattan directory for Upton Associates and Frank dialed the number. Luckily, the head of the firm had not yet gone to lunch, and by quiet persistence Frank finally got through to him. My name's Frank Hardy, Mr. Upton, he began. My father is Fenton Hardy, the detective. You may have heard of him. Well, what is it you want? The rumbling bass voice challenged. My brother Joe and I would like a chance to talk to you as soon as possible. What about? A case which our father's investigating. It involves Chelsea Builders. Nothing doing, the architect replied grumpily. We have no contact with that firm. You may still be able to help us, sir. I said nothing doing. Very well, Frank said, and on a sudden impulse added, then may I speak to your son Lou? There was a slight pause, and Frank sensed that Zachary Upton had been taken aback by the sudden mention of his son's name. He's not here, Upton finally responded. Can you tell us how to get in touch with him? This isn't a secretarial bureau. I'm running a firm of architects. Frank decided to apply a little pressure. His voice hardened. It's very important that we speak to Bubbles, he said, emphasizing the nickname slightly. We want to question him about a burglary that occurred at Chelsea Builders last night. The safe was cracked. Frank could hear a faint gasp at the other end of the line. Safe cracking, you say? That's right, Mr. Upton. My brother and I went there this morning and examined the scene of the burglary. We discovered a clue that may link your son to the crime. Now we'd like to give him a chance to explain. However, if you prefer, we can simply call the police and let them follow up. No, don't do that just yet, Zachary Upton said hastily. If you'll call back in about an hour, I'll do my best to arrange an interview with my son.
Fine.
Thank you, sir, Frank said politely. Hanging up, he turned to his brother with a dry grin. That changed his tune in a hurry. While waiting to phone back, the Hardys returned to the skyscraper from which Joe had taken his terrifying tumble the night before. The construction crew were still on their lunch break, as the two young sleuths had hoped, so they were able to have a brief chat with their friend Hank Kegel. As he mentioned the man's strange remark about the tomahawk, Frank saw Hank's eyes flicker, as if he were startled but trying not to show any sign of recognition. Any idea what the man was talking about? The older Hardy boy inquired. Casually. Hank Eagle shrugged. None. For the rest of the conversation he seemed rather taciturn and withdrawn, masking whatever was going on in his head behind a deadpan face. Did you notice how Hank clammed up all of a sudden when you asked him about that tomahawk? Joe remarked to his brother later as they walked away from the construction site. I'll say I did, Frank replied. He knows more than he's telling us, that's for sure. But why? You don't suppose he's in cahoots with Mr. Nest? Frank shook his head. That doesn't stack up with what we know about Hank, not with our previous opinion of him anyhow. I've got a hunch about why Mr. Nest set up a meeting with us and tossed out that crack about the tomahawk. Why? He wanted to find out from our expressions if we knew anything about it. When he saw our blank faces, he realized we didn't, and that's all he was interested in. So he took off and left us sitting there like dummies. That figures all right, Joe agreed. At a nearby drugstore, Frank made another call to Upton Associates. This time, Zachary Upton was much less hostile. He was still vague and uncertain about arranging a meeting between the Hardys and his son. However, he agreed readily to see the boys himself and discuss the matter further. I'd like to keep this confidential, he added. Could we meet somewhere away from my office? You name the time and place, Mr. Upton, Frank said. Very well then. How about 2:30 this afternoon at the Boat Pond Inn, Central Park? The architect added directions in case the Hardys were not familiar with the layout of the park, and a description of himself. We'll be there, Frank promised and hung up. The boys had left their car overnight in a parking garage, so after some window shopping on 5th Avenue, they took a bus north and went into Central Park at the East 72nd Street entrance. The pond at which they were to meet Upton lay just a short stroll away. The architect was easily identifiable from the description of himself that he had given Frank, a big shaggy bear of a man with a closely trimmed dark beard, streaked with gray. Several toy boats were being sailed on the pond. As the boys approached, they realized that Upton was playing with one of them, steering it by means of an electronic remote control device which he held in one hand. Mr. Upton, said Frank. The bearded man turned to look at the two youths. Yes, you must be Frank and Joe Hardy. Yes, sir. Let's get right to the point if you don't mind. Whatever you say, son. First of all, we'd like to learn more about your relationship with Chelsea Builders, and then we want to know how soon we can talk to your son. Well, now that's a fairly big order. Just what did you mean by that first question? Are you implying that Upton Associates or I may have something to do with that burglary you mentioned? Frank attempted to reply diplomatically, but Upton paid little attention. He seemed more interested in steering his toy boat across the water, and the Hardys had the odd impression that he was stalling for time. Suddenly, as his boat reached the opposite side of the pond, they saw a young man stoop and snatch it up. Frank and Joe thought he slipped something into the little craft, but he acted so quickly and unexpectedly that neither could be sure. As suddenly as he had picked up the boat, the youth put it back in the water. Then he turned and darted off among some trees. Upton was already steering the boat back to their own side of the pond. As soon as it came within reach, he stooped down and plucked out a rolled-up slip of paper, which he handed to the Hardys. That young man you saw just now was my son Lou, he informed them. Frank hastily unrolled the note. It bore a message scrawled in ink. Mop job. Tell your father to watch out or we are both. Chapter 14. The Mustached Stranger. The Hardy boys gasped as they read the strange warning that Lou Upton had sent them in the toy boat. Frank shot a puzzled glance at the bearded architect, who stood by watching them somberly. "What's this all about, Mr. Upton?" he asked. The man shrugged. "Don't ask me. I assumed you'd know. The message is meant for you." He explained that, ever since getting out of prison a few weeks ago, his son had been living by himself, apparently somewhere in the city, but avoiding contact with his family. Lou said it was better that way for all of us, that he didn't want any of his underworld troubles brushing off on his mother and me, Zachary Upton went on. "However, he would call us every so often, and he gave me a number where I could reach him in case of emergency. That's how I got in touch with him after you called today." Upton related that his son had sounded very disturbed when he heard that the Hardys wanted to talk to him about the Chelsea Builders burglary. "He told me that it was important to get a message to you fast, but he didn't want to be seen with any of us. That's why we arranged this toy boat gimmick." Despite his gruff front, Upton was obviously very much worried about Lou's safety, especially in light of the first two words in the message. "Mob job," implied that some gangster setup was behind the safecracking. Frank and Joe were also concerned about their father, although they knew he was usually well able to protect himself from criminals. But for the moment, neither the Hardy boys nor Zachary Upton could guess what had prompted the message. The two young sleuths said goodbye to the architect and retrieved their car from the parking garage. Soon they were heading homeward. Arriving in Bayport, they learned that Fenton Hardy had not yet returned, so they decided to stay overnight before starting for the Adirondacks again. "Maybe we'd better let Chet know our plans," Joe suggested. "Good idea," said Frank, and called the cottage. Before leaving Hawk River, the Hardys had cautioned their stout chum to speak cagily over the phone for fear of their conversation being overheard by the gossipy local operator. Keeping this in mind, Chet managed to let Frank know by his remarks that he had kept a midnight vigil outside the Tabor house, but that nothing unusual had happened. "Okay, Chet," Frank replied. "Same deal tonight. We'll see you tomorrow. We want to talk to Dad, so we're going to stick around in case he shows up this evening. Meanwhile, take care of yourself." "You think I won't?" Frank chuckled and hung up. Before dinner, the boys drove to Wild World, an animal park outside Bayport. They asked their elderly friend, Pop Carter, who operated the establishment, if they could borrow a tranquilizer dart gun. "We may need it to capture a werewolf, Pop," Frank explained. "If anyone else had told me that," Pop replied, "I'd suspect that he was crazy. But with you Hardys, I'm ready to believe anything." He gave them the gun, and the brothers returned home. By the following morning, there was still no word from their father. Hiding their own worried feelings, the boys did their best to reassure their mother and Aunt Gertrude. Soon they were on their way once more to the Adirondacks. En route, the Hardys detoured to the Catskill Mountain area to visit the Pine Manor Rest Home. They asked at the reception desk if they could speak to the doctor who had treated John Tabor. The receptionist smiled in surprise. "That's a coincidence," she remarked. "Another visitor came in 15 minutes ago asking the same thing. He's with Dr. Benton right now." Frank and Joe sat down to await their turn, wondering who the visitor could be. When the receptionist finally escorted them down a hallway, they saw a man with a thick black mustache coming out of the doctor's office. The Hardys were curious if he was the person who had inquired about the young architect and his nervous breakdown. Dr. Benton was a thin, fussy-looking individual. His manner seemed rather curt and impatient, as if he were tired of answering questions about the Tabor case. However, when the boys showed him the letter signed by his former patient, he agreed to spare them a few minutes. "Do you mind telling us who that man was who just left here?" Frank asked. "He came here for the same reason you did. It wouldn't be proper for me to discuss his business with you." The physician told them briefly about the treatment which young Tabor had received at the sanatorium. He scoffed at any notion that his apparent breakdown might have been purely imaginary and brought on by outside enemies. "That's ridiculous," the doctor snapped. "John was definitely suffering from delusions. Even while he was here, he reported hearing the voices of his werewolf ancestors. They wouldn't be hard to fake," Joe pointed out. "With a few electronic gimmicks, we could make any patient here imagine the same thing." Frank nodded. "That's true, sir. By hiding one or more miniaturized radio receivers in his room, we could be miles from the sanatorium and still broadcast such voices to a patient. By planting both a bug and a receiver, we Could even make him think he was carrying on a two-way conversation with a ghost. The doctor frowned. To do that, you'd first have to get to his room, and I can assure you that none of John's so-called enemies had a chance to do that. A staff employee might have been bribed to plant the radio gimmicks, Joe. Reason. I resent any such suggestion, young man. If you'll let us check the room John Tabor occupied while he was a patient. Here, Frank said. We can soon tell you if it contains any bugs or other devices. Dr. Benton seemed somewhat upset, but reluctantly agreed. The Hardys got a kit of detection gear which they had brought along in their car and proceeded to make an electronic sweep of the room in question. They not only checked the walls for hidden devices but also the bedside lamp, furniture, and other items.
No luck.
Joe grumbled. That doesn't prove the trickery didn't happen, Frank pointed out. Whoever planted the gimmicks may have removed them as soon as John Tabor checked out of the sanatorium. The older Hardy boy suddenly broke off speaking, shoved the chair he had been examining out of the way and darted toward the door. What's wrong? Joe exclaimed. I saw a guy peeking at us. The two young sleuths rushed out in pursuit. As they emerged into the corridor, a door slammed shut down the hall. It appeared to lead to another wing of the sanatorium, but when the boys tried it, it would not open. He must have pushed the lock button as he went through. Frank fumed. What did this eavesdropper look like? Joe asked. I only got a brief glance at him. He was rather heavyset with light blonde hair, dressed in white, probably a male nurse or attendant. He could have been the guy who planted the radio gimmick. When Dr. Benton heard their story, he seemed more upset than ever. Instead of offering to help find the culprit, he insisted that the Hardys leave the sanatorium, pointing out that they had utterly failed to prove their suspicions. The boys stopped at a roadside diner for sandwiches. Frank pulled out the name and address of the owner of Eagle's Nest. He lives near New Paltz, which isn't far from here, the boy stated. Should we stop in and see him? What have we got to lose? The client, whose name was Crawford, proved to be a wealthy retired businessman, a balding, courtly-mannered old gentleman. He seemed delighted by the Hardys' visit. Come into my study, boys, he invited them. When they were comfortably seated, he said, Now then, what can I do for you? Frank explained how they had happened to visit Eagle's Nest. Then he told about the gray-haired man in dark glasses who had eavesdropped on their conversation with Hank and later arranged to meet them at a restaurant in New York. Mr. Crawford snapped his fingers. I know exactly whom you're talking about. Really, sir? We'd like to learn more about him. He called himself Mr. Nest. But Joe and I are certain that name is an alias. You bet it is. His real name is Marburg. He's an antique dealer who specializes in old manuscripts and autographs, or so he says. How did you meet him? Joe asked. Well, shortly after I bought Eagle's Nest, there was a story in one of the New York papers. It reported that I was having the old mansion restored, how I planned to make it into a historic showplace. Next day I got a call from Marburg. He offered to buy any old documents that turned up during the restoration. I tried to be polite and honest. Told him I didn't expect to find anything of value. After all, the house has been sitting up there in the woods for years, an empty shell just rotting away. But Marburg refused to take no for an answer. He kept pestering me with calls, Mr. Crawford went on. Even drove all the way from New York City just to see me. Finally I became fed up. Didn't trust him anyhow. He sounded like crook to me. I told him I wanted nothing to do with him, and if he bothered me anymore, I wouldn't even give him the chance to bid on anything that turned up. I wonder why he lied to us about his name, Frank mused. In my opinion, said the elderly businessman, it merely confirms what I suspected all along. The man's dishonest. He's ready to go to any lengths to lay his hands on whatever valuable items come to light. But he recognized you as the Hardy boys. So he's trying to cover himself, hoping you won't be able to trace him if he has to resort to theft or trickery. What about the tomahawk he mentioned? Joe asked. Mr. Crawford shrugged.
No.
Telling. Wouldn't surprise me if it were part of some elaborate confidence game he's playing. The Hardys thanked their elderly informant and resumed their drive to the Adirondacks. When they arrived at Hawk River in mid-afternoon, Chet burst out of the cabin to greet them. You really missed some action here last night, he blurted. Joe hopped out of the car and stretched his arms and legs. What happened? Plenty. For openers, there were more wolf howls and werewolf attacks. Were you keeping an eye on the Tabor's house? Frank put in anxiously. The chubby boy nodded and threw out his chest. You bet I was. In fact, I came near solving the mystery all by myself. Well, don't keep us in suspense, Joe urged. Give us a blow-by-blow. Okay. If you'll listen and give me a chance, I will. I was up in the tree same as before, see? Something seemed to be moving in the shadows and all of a sudden I caught on. There was another guy keeping watch on the house. Did you get a look at him, Chet? Not right away. It was too dark where he was standing. As I told you, he was in the shadows. Let's just call him Mr. X. Suits us. But what happened? Chet related that shortly before midnight he had seen John Tabor sneak out of the house. Was this before or after the howls started? Right after. The chubby youth shuddered. Boy, it was weird. Almost as if he heard the wild wolves calling him and was going out in the woods to join them. Anyway, Mr. X started tailing him. So naturally I followed both of them, and when they got out in the open moor, out in the moonlight, I finally got a chance to see what Mr. X looked like. He was a thick-set guy with a dark cap and a big droopy dark mustache. The Hardys exclaimed almost in unison. Same guy we saw at the sanatorium. Frank added more cautiously. At least the description fits. Go on with your story, Chet. Their stout chum reported that he had followed the two men up a wooded hillside. We were going along quietly, he continued, when suddenly I heard a twig crack as if someone stepped on it. Not in front of me, behind me, Joe said. Oh, you mean someone was following you? That's what it sounded like. Chet gulped as he recalled his feelings at that scary moment. Man, I was really shook up. What did you do? Joe asked tensely. I froze for a moment, then crouched down in a clump of brush. I figured if somebody was shadowing me, I'd waylay him and grab him as he came by. Frank waited for the climax of the story. Any luck? Oh, I caught him all right, Chet said ruefully. But I'm not sure how lucky I was. The guy fought like a wildcat. We were rolling all around in the dark. Then he grabbed a stone and conked me on the head. When I came to, everything was silent. So I came back here to the cabin, and I never even got a good look at the fellow I was scrapping with. Never mind. You did fine, Chet, and showed plenty of nerve in a tight spot. Frank clapped the boy on the back, then frowned thoughtfully. But this gives the case a new twist. Two other guys keeping John Tabor under surveillance. Any hunches about who they are? Joe asked, eyeing his brother hopefully.
No.
But I'd sure like to know where John was going. Could you show us the route he took, Chet? Chet Morton shrugged. I could try. The three boys drove to a spot near the Tabor house, then parked and got out, with Chet leading the way. He guided them away from the road, through a ragged patch of woods and over a rough, uneven stretch of terrain. Finally they clambered up a hillside. Hey, look, Joe exclaimed, pointing ahead. Beyond the trees they glimpsed a small hut. Wow, I didn't see that last night, said Chet. That must be where John Tabor was heading. The Bayport trio pressed forward and entered the hut. It was littered with books and papers. Besides a table, chair, cot, and wood stove, there was a drawing board with an architectural sketch pinned to it, and various drafting instruments. Electricity was supplied by a small generator. This must be where John comes to study and sketch out ideas for his designs, said Frank, glancing around with interest. Hey, look at this, Joe said, holding up what appeared to be a fur rug. It's a wolf skin, gasped Chet. Right, complete from nose to tail. The head even has glass eyes. Frank, who hurried to his brother's side, turned it over. And leather straps with buckles are on the underside, so a person can strap it on. In their excitement over the find, the boys failed to hear footsteps approaching outside the hut. Suddenly the door burst open and a voice bellowed, "You're all under arrest."